particular case, I asked Pete to double check with Breslin before signing me up to speak here. Because with Jimmy, you just never know. He never seemed to think much of his editors. And of course, Jimmy doesn't suffer fools gladly. Some days he doesn't care much for wise men either. During my career as an editor at Newsday, I had the great privilege of working with two of the great columnists in American journalism, the great columnists here, apologies, Murray Kempton and Jimmy Breslin. Kempton was ice to Jimmy's fire. Jimmy wrote, and I certainly will not try to do the voice given the great, impeccable, dead ring imitation that we've heard already. Rage, he said, is the only quality which kept me or anybody else I have studied writing columns for newspapers. He wrote that in a statement, and I keep posted that statement even now on the side of my printer at home. When New York Newsday lured Breslin away from the Daily News, the publisher, Ronnie, had to back up a Brinks truck by Newsday standards to subsidize the operation. His salary, we were told, was paid from the budget of the promotion department and hidden from view. Murray Kempton, however, caught wind of it. And he went to the Newsday editor, Tony Marrow, and Murray said, "Is it true Breslin is making $350,000? He said, "This is a concern of my ex-wife." That was back in the 80s when 350 G's was 350 G's. Come to think of it, we were back in those days. In fact, they're long gone for the working stiffs of newspaper men and women these days. No one is better at summing up that golden age of the newspaper era than Jimmy Breslin. I had him speak to my journalism class at Columbia University a few years back. Of course, I had to clean it up the next class after he left. And among other things, Jimmy described in his particular way the change in the newspaper writing. And he said it this way, and I was afraid someone would read it before I did. And again, I won't do the voice, but I have this in my speech when I'm on the road, say like in Nashville, I'll do his imitation. But I wouldn't risk it in New York. And certainly not on this stage. But the quote was, "Tremendous scene." He says, "At 5 o'clock at night in the New York Daily News, you couldn't see from one end of the city room to the other because of the smoke. Tremendous scene. Looked like an old fight club. And the noise of the typewriters were loud, like subway trains running through. And out of all of this noise, the smoke, came nervous energy. And they had that." He always threw that in. It was his punctuation. "Afterwards, there were bars people went to, and you discussed how people wrote. Used to be discussions about writing styles at the bar. There's no such thing today. Afterwards, nobody goes to a saloon and discuss language, newspaper reporting language. They go to a health club." And then Jimmy wrote, "Worst of all, they go home."
Thanks, Les. Thank you, Les. They're yelling at me from off stage to speed it up. The next speaker is another son of Queens, someone who has a master's from this great university, NYU, someone who in one of his first jobs in '94 shared a Pulitzer and then moved to the New York Times in 1995. He did the Around New York column for a while and now does a column that's sort of called The Land. With any title, it is a beautifully written and deeply reported column. Please welcome Dan Barry.
I guess I should speed it up. I go way back with Jimmy. He doesn't know it, but we go way back. When I was a kid, my father would say, "Read Breslin today." Never good morning. Never I love you. Just read Breslin today. The advice was good and bad. Good because I got to read the prose of this journalistic genius, Breslin. Bad because, like so many other young reporters, I developed a Breslin tic. For example, I wanted every paragraph to end with one word: beautiful. Just the way Breslin used to end some of his paragraphs, but when I used this technique, it didn't seem to have the same effect. The Zoning Board of Appeals endorsed a plan last night to build a super Stop and Shop on Tolland Road. Beautiful. Now here's my Jimmy Breslin story. It's a story about the person and not the character. And I'm not going to do a Breslin imitation. I can't quite capture that voice that sounds like an altar boy who has swallowed broken glass. About 5 years ago, Jimmy Breslin calls me and he asks, "When do you have to go to that place for that thing?" "I'll walk over there with you." That place refers to Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, a building that Jimmy knew well, unfortunately. That thing was a scary, unpleasant procedure I had to undergo. Of course, every procedure at Sloan Kettering is scary and unpleasant. But I didn't know what he meant by walking over there with me. In fact, I had never met Jimmy Breslin. I had only talked to him on the phone. Anyway, we arranged to meet on the Upper West Side. I am very nervous. Mostly about this procedure I'm about to have, but also about meeting and walking with Jimmy Breslin. I spot him. He's easy to pick out of a crowd. I introduce myself. We start walking east, and he starts talking about everything. He talks about mobsters, John Gotti, Sammy the Bull, the Ravenite Social Club. We're now in Central Park, and I'm laughing. He talks about sports, Willie Mays and Leo DeRocher, Emil Griffith and Benny Perrette, the New York Mets. We're now on the East Side, and I'm laughing. He talks about the war in Iraq, Bush and this goddamn war. We're now in front of the hospital. That was quick. My wife arrives, and I turn to say goodbye to Jimmy. Instead, he comes into the hospital with us, and he's telling funny stories now to the both of us. I check in at the admissions desk, and Jimmy's beside me, still telling stories. Great stories. I go into the small locker room, get into one of those Johnnies that leaves your ass exposed, come out, and there's Jimmy. I sit down between my wife and Jimmy Breslin, and I'm the only one with my ass exposed. Now he's asking me what my column is going to be for Wednesday, which is 2 days away. I say that, I was thinking of taking the day off, considering the procedure and all. "Screw that," he says. He didn't use screw. "Find something, anything. Write it up." The nurse is inserting the needle for the IV, and Jimmy is sitting beside me. He's beside her, and he's telling the nurse and me that I have to find something to write. This is New York City. Finally, I get onto the gurney. I make room for Jimmy. He shakes my hand, and only then does he leave that place. The next day, I'm walking around Manhattan, feeling sorry for myself. Jimmy Breslin calls me. "What do you got for tomorrow?" "I got nothing," I say. "What with the procedure and all?" "Screw that. Look around you. Stories everywhere. Write it. Goodbye." Only then did I realize what Jimmy Breslin had done for me on our walk to the hospital. He had given me the gift of distraction. He had filibustered away my fears. What's more, he had reminded me of my responsibility to write. So I went back to the newsroom and I wrote a column. That column, forgettable. This story I just told you, beautiful.
Just great. Before we go on, I'd like to acknowledge two other editors of the Daily News, my lifelong friend, Ed Kozner, and the current editor, Martin Dunn. The next speaker is also a son of New York, from as far uptown in Manhattan as you can get without being in the Bronx. He has two Pulitzers. One he shared with a group at Newsday, and the other was for commentary in 1995. He is writing for the Times, a column that deserves everybody's attention, full of intelligence and wit and irony. Please welcome Jim Dwyer.
I'm like Michael Daly on that British Airway flight. I'm sitting next to Breslin, and as soon as I sat down, he said, "This is cruel." I said, "Good." I think, as Dan pointed out very wisely, the biggest mistake you can make as a writer is to read Breslin before you start, because you do get those tics, and trying to imitate him is a lost and hopeless cause. He called my house one time when there was some sickness there, and spoke to a member of the family, and she said to him, "Well, Jimmy, it's wonderful that you're still writing, still out there working." And he's, "What do you think this is, the TWU?" And but I've read Jimmy, since he was in the news, and then I bought the old books like a lot of people did, and I just want to read a little bit of. I guess, is this allowed? Has this been outlawed? I haven't heard anybody else do it, so I'm going to do it. This is from Selma, Alabama, in 1962. Yeah, so it's about a school off of Highway 80 in Lowndes County. It is the public school of the state of Alabama for grades 1 to 6. It has 80 Negro students and 3 Negro teachers. It is open from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., but from the road it looks like a deserted shack. The Roland School is a wooden building that was a church when people in Lowndes County wore Confederate uniforms. It once was painted yellow. The building sits off the ground on small piles of loose red bricks. It has 10 frame windows. Nearly all the panes are broken. Beaverboard put up on the inside covers the broken window. The school has a tin roof. Yesterday, part of the roof was flapping in the breeze coming through the fields. In the winter, the wind comes strong and keeps blowing parts of the roof away, and the students sit in class under the cold sky. A shack in the dirt field behind the school serves as a bathroom. There's a small coal bin on the side of the school. A tin basin used by students for carrying coal inside to the pot-bellied stoves is on the ground next to the bin. A long-handled axe stands against the building. The students gather wood at lunchtime and chop it for the fires inside. The school has a church entrance with 5 wooden steps leading up from the dirt. The steps are rotted, and an adult cannot stand on them. I think, was this a journalism school event, right? Yeats said, Irish poets learn your trade. Journalism students. Jimmy Breslin is not about the clatter and the voice and the commotion of these funny stories and this antic behavior you hear about. It's not that. It's really the stainless steel truths of what he was writing down in these very plain sentences from Alabama. One of my favorite things in New York is the George Washington Bridge, because when they built it, they ran out of money. It was supposed to be clad in granite. And instead you have these big steel towers, the steel cables, and you see every bit of the skeleton and muscle of this structure. And the little bit I just read of Jimmy is its own kind of bridge, right? You just step into that prose today, 2009, 47 years ago, 1962, and you're standing in a building that was working during the Confederacy, and the Confederacy was still working through it, and that's what he was telling us about. There's a girl in the second grade, Janice Cosby. On the first page, she had printed, "See the kitten. The kitten says mew mew." It was neatly done. "Do you like the school?" she was asked. Her eyes brightened and her head shook up and down. "Yup," she said. "Do you do any writing at home?" "Yup, in the backyard when I get home." "Would you want to write something for me now?" She grinned and picked up a pencil and carefully printed, "Sunday is the day before Monday." "That's very good," she was told. She beamed and began printing something else. "What does her father do?" the teacher was asked. "Farmer, sharecropper." "And what happens to the girl here?" "When she gets old enough, she goes into the field and picks cotton and doesn't come to school anymore." I found this in this old book of The World of Breslin, and at times when I think about these wonderful things that happened during the years I worked with him at Newsday, like the time he got called at 6:30 in the morning by a clerk because the editor was not allowed to talk to him anymore, or whatever it was, or they were pissing at each other over something. And there had been a fire somewhere, and the clerk said, "Mr. Breslin, Mr. Forrest would like you to know." And I said, "What?" "There was a fire, and there was how many dead?" "Well, there's 2 people now." "More must die before Breslin goes." And but he went, and he came back, and so if you guys are out there in digital land, looking at your computer screens, I know you're going to get out and do a little bit of what Jimmy did. It's what keeps us all going. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to read another very brief piece, and then we're almost at the finish line, I swear. But Sam Roberts was city editor of the Daily News many years ago. He's now, for many years, worked at the New York Times, both as an editor, as the urban affairs correspondent.
I'm here, but I'd rather you read it.
Oh, well, then come up and read it. We weren't sure he'd be back.
Thank you. I got it. Thanks. Only at NYU could you have the Glucksman Institute for Irish Studies. Isn't that great? That says so much about New York and so much about Breslin. My day used to begin and end with Jimmy Breslin, and they were better days for it. Those outbursts about something you'd just read or seen on TV, the pregnant pauses on the phone as his simmering exasperation began to boil into rage. As Les said, rage is the only quality which has kept him or anybody he's ever studied writing columns for newspapers. There's not enough outrage anymore, I don't think. After all these years, it's easy to enrage Breslin. It's, almost no fun anymore. As he said, no slight, no difference is so small that it can't be converted into a feud. His victims, Hugh Carey, Bess Meyerson, Daily News editorial writers, British Airways, always lost. During the debate over whether the throaty roar of the Concorde, the supersonic jet, should be allowed